welcome back to virtual food safety office hours. Back by popular demand today is part 2 of the FSMA final rule for food traceability presentation session. So the first one, there was a really high enrollment and lots of questions that the panel just ran out of time and didn't get a chance to answer. So we are coming back to the topic again today, and we have 2 invited speakers joining us. So the first is Melanie Neumann of Neumann Advisory Services, and she is an entrepreneur in residence at Cornell University, a food law attorney, and a food safety risk management consultant. And also we have Dr. Jennifer McEntire, who is the founder of Food Safety Strategy, which is a food safety consulting firm, and she has expertise in risk communication, traceability, and food safety regulations. So they have prepared brief presentations to serve as kind of a recap and some perspectives on FSMA 204, and then we'll transition into a Q&A. So we have all of your questions that were left from the last time, questions submitted through your registration this time, and you are welcome to drop more questions in the chat live today. And so we'll be facilitating this panel afterwards as well. And so I think we have joining me, we have Donna of the Produce Safety Alliance from Cornell. I think Al of Dairy Foods Extension is here too. His name isn't on the slide, but he's definitely in the room. So all of us together will be facilitating that Q&A at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our invited speakers.
Well, thanks for having us back. Melanie and I are going to tag team on this. And as Dr. Snyder said, we do have a couple of slides just to remind you of the topic, what we talked about in December, and then Melanie and I will take some questions. So let's start with December. I don't know how many of you were on, but FDA's Adam Friedlander gave an overview of the rule. As of the moment, the January 2026 compliance date for this rule does still stand. It's not been changed. I know that was a common question, and we can get into that a little bit more later. There were a lot of questions, and so we're happy. We'd like to spend the majority of the time today answering your questions, but first we'll give a brief overview of the rule. Let's back up and talk about why there even is a traceability rule. Why does the rule exist? What problem are we trying to solve? And the rule, if you read it, if you read the summaries, they talk about recalls and they talk about outbreaks. But recalls and outbreaks are not synonymous. They are not the same thing. And want to dive into that a little bit more so that as Melanie starts talking about the requirements of the rule, you have a little better understanding and idea of why FDA is asking for certain things and why they're asking for things to be done in certain ways. Within the food industry, we talk a lot about recalls. We have a lot of recalls, but a recall is generally driven by a company. They know what they're recalling. There's some product, and the product still exists. It is still in the supply chain, and the goal of the recall is to remove that product from the supply chain. Take it out of distribution centers, off grocery store shelves, out of people's refrigerators or pantries, going out to the consumer, pulling that product that could cause harm if consumed, making sure that people don't actually consume it. In an outbreak, the product has been consumed. It is gone, and it's caused illness or injury. And there's an outbreak investigation. And the regulators, public health officials, start by asking people, what did you eat? Trying to figure out, was it even food? What food might it have been? And working back with FDA through the supply chain to figure out, what is the product? That is the question that the regulators are trying to solve in an outbreak. It is not known, and the food may or may not still exist, but some people have eaten that food, they've gotten sick, and the regulators are reliant on records to show where that food might have come from. What was the path that it took back to figure out what was the food? I believe, my personal opinion, that this traceability rule that we're talking about today will do a lot more to aid in this outbreak investigation trace back process than in the recall trace forward process. Trace forward, you can just clear the shelves. Trace back, You're really trying to solve a puzzle with very limited information. And we know that supply chains are not as simple as the previous slide, that there can be many distributors, many processors, packers, farms in a supply chain, and trying to figure out which one might have produced, might have grown, might have packed this violative product, relying on just historical records, which to date are mostly purchase orders, bills of lading, trying to trace back and figure out between all these different stores and all these different restaurants, maybe in different states, what did they have in common? What is that point of convergence is really, really difficult. So recalls and outbreaks, they're different. The direction that the records are flowing in that we're trying to investigate is different, with tracebacks being a lot more difficult. And it's where I think this rule can make a difference. And we need to be pretty targeted and exact in tracing back so that we don't accidentally cast a very wide net, which we have seen result in government advisories. If they can't figure out whose romaine it is, they say don't eat romaine. Can't figure out where the spinach came from, it's don't eat spinach. They know the papayas were from Mexico, but not where. Don't import papayas from Mexico. Having better traceability information will avoid, I think, avoid us being in those situations. So with that, I think Mel, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Jen, and thanks for just keeping the slides up and managing it from here on out. Yeah, I agree with you, Jen, that I think this rule is that you can argue that, maybe some other rules maybe have, I don't know, a little less clear line of sight to impact and applicability, but this one really does. As Jen mapped out, and I think those graphics, are really helpful to visually see, like, we are trying to solve a puzzle. And these outbreak investigations typically take weeks at best, and often months. And to just think about how many more consumers are falling ill every day because we don't have the data as an industry that is connected. We have the data. What this is really driving us to do, in large measure, we do have a lot of this information, these critical pieces of information we'll talk about here momentarily. But we haven't been incented to really connect the dots and have each node of the supply chain be able to capture and translate that data so we can get all the way back to that farm or that processor or that source of the potential contamination that are causing these kinds of outbreaks. So ultimately, this rule really is meant to, and I think will really help foster protection of consumer health and safety. All that said, my personal opinion aside, what is this rule? Like Jennifer said, Adam Freelander from FDA gave the best overview, so we encourage you to go back and listen to that recording from the December session. But broad strokes, it is a final regulation. It is one of the Food Safety Modernization Act rules that Congress had charged FDA with creating. Its implementation date, as of today, God only knows what will happen tomorrow, still stands January 2026, and routine investigations don't start until 2027. Now, just a little caveat, if there's an outbreak, once this rule is effective in 2026, you do still need to produce that electronic sortable spreadsheet in an outbreak. But like regular routine compliance inspections are not supposed to begin until 2027. And Jen, if I misspeak on any of these things, you are fully authorized to jump in over my voice and overturn me. But again, as a lot of things are, things are changing, rather quickly, but I don't foresee a change in this, and I could be proven wrong in any second, but this is again, going back to it's final. This rule is final, it is finalized, and so should not have, much risk of repeal. And I think that, look, face it, even if it does, this is an industry best practice. This is something that industry is collaborating with FDA, with each other, and trying to figure out ways for this, what we call interoperability, to occur, for these systems and these data points to really speak to each other, and like think of a baton handoff in a race, and so that we're not dropping batons between supply chain nodes as we are, growing, making, moving food throughout the supply chain. That said, this rule only applies to certain foods that are on what's called the food traceability list, often referred to as FTL for short. It also, and again, an important note is it applies to any food that contains a food on the food traceability list. So think of like nut butters, for example, and there'll be a slide here momentarily that shows you what the list includes. But if you receive a food on the FTL, like nut butters, and you incorporate that into your own finished product, that is something that you'll need to trace forward, or keep track of and trace under the requirements of this rule, unless for some reason it falls under an exemption. At each step of the way, as we're talking about each kind of, step of the supply chain or node in the supply chain, there are certain key data elements that are required. So certain pieces of data information we need to collect at each stage, which is called a critical tracking event. And we'll show you that here momentarily as well. The rule requires a electronic sortable spreadsheet within 24 hours of FDA's request. It does not require a software program. It does not require full digital optimization. It requires an electronic sortable spreadsheet within 24 hours of request. FDA has some great resources right on the website. It actually got built out much faster and more robustly for this rule than I have seen in previous rules. So I'm actually really impressed with the quality and quantity of resources on the FDA's website. Encourage you to go there because they have an example of this electronic sortable spreadsheet, for example. They have an example of what a food traceability plan looks like, which you'll see in the last bullet here is also required. That's a documented plan to say, what's your plan? How do you trace products that are subject to this rule? What are your procedures associated with that? And there's no one form or format you have to use for that. Think SOP that lays out what your policies and procedural steps are in association with these requirements. If we go on to the next slide, there's been some newer, either new concepts or new updates fairly recently, more clarification and around this rule, such as for farms, there is a requirement for a farm map in association with your traceability plan. Again, if you go back to the concept that's graphically presented on the bottom of the slide, if one of the main goals of this rule is to be able to go to the end location or the last mile, if you will, where consumers will purchase food and potentially become ill, and as quickly and as accurately as possible go back to the source. So that farm map helps to identify source. What section of land is this? So that they can determine how much is, for example, at issue or at risk. Are there physical barriers that could separate and help create a conversation around some brackets where it's not hundreds of acres at risk, it's 2, for example. But again, really all driving back to identification of the source of the issue. Harvesters are required to also capture certain key data elements. The initial packer is the one to assign the traceability lot code, TLC for short, you might hear or read. And that lot code, what's different than before this rule was issued is that lot code can't be changed every time it goes to every single step in the supply chain, which is typically what often happens. So you can imagine if a product on the FTL has moved 5 times and it's got reassigned a lot code 4 or 5 different times, it's going to take a minute to connect all the dots back to the source and try to figure out where the source of the problem or the outbreak had come from. By retaining that traceability lot code through the supply chain, And restricting how many participants can change it is going to help, again, expedite the trace back, which is the goal of this rule. Transformation requires associating that traceability law code. So when you materially transform the product, you still need to keep track of that traceability law code. And so those are kind of some of the key high level reminders in association of this rule. And I don't know, Jen, before we go on from the slide, if you have anything to add here.
Nope.
All right, let's keep rocking and rolling. Again, just kind of an up close and larger look at what the food traceability list contains. And it's important, again, to remember it's not just these products, it's the form. So fresh is included in a lot of these designated, right? Frozen isn't mentioned, which means frozen is not. Foods that are foods that that are on this list that you use in other foods that contain an FTL food are also included. So product type and product form and or storage condition, whether it's sliced, whether it's fresh cut or whole, makes a difference. And so there's a bit of nuance to what really truly is included on this list. Now, the reality is we in the industry are seeing a lot of letters from customers, retailers, big buyers, 800-pound gorillas in the food industry saying thou shalt apply these concepts and this rule requirements to all of your products. Does that surprise me? No. I mean, customers have always kind of driven the ceiling when it comes to food safety, and that's not such a bad thing. I mean, we've seen this throughout the evolution of the, Global Food Safety Initiative, for example, and we go through customer audits all the time, right? So having customers kind of drive what I'll call a safety net, a cushion, some gap between what's minimum regulatory compliance and what's industry, best or better practice, arguably speaking. We're seeing a lot of this. So really understanding who are your customers, what are their requirements, is one tip to kind of, get a step ahead, stay a step ahead of the implementation within your own companies of this rule, because you just might have to apply it to all of your products regardless. If we move on to the next slide, we will, have just an overview. These are the kinds of critical tracking events that I referred to before. These are like the stages of the nodes of the supply chain where certain key data elements are required. FDA has a great, again, going back to impressed by the website immensely. They've got a great tool that lays out by each KTE what are the key data elements for each one of these steps or players in the supply chain. So harvesters, for example, have a list of the information that they have to retain. And I think on the next slide, it'll show kind of a layout of what this looks like and what you'd be looking for on the FDA's website. And you can click on, it's not live here, but you could click on each one of these critical tracking events or critical tracking steps, if you will, and it will give you the list of the information that you need to be able to capture and move forward in the supply chain. And so one of the tips that we have as far as like, what can we do now? Maybe we're slow out of the gates. What is one thing we can do is do a current state gap assessment. Talk with your supply chain, partners or procurement, the people who are buying your goods, for example. Take a look at the products you make. Take a look to see if any of the foods on the FTL list go into your products, or maybe that is your business, is a product that's on the FTL list. And go through these requirements at each critical tracking event to see, what are you already doing? What do you already have in place, whether it be manual or not? What could you move a step forward to achieve this electronic sortable spreadsheet that is the requirement under this rule? Where may you, have conversations with procurement along with IT to say, does it make sense for us to move to a digital platform? No, that's a business decision, not a regulatory requirement. But it may make sense to, ensure that you feel confident in the, information being complete and accurate. But again, I encourage you to go here and take a look at what the requirements are for each step. What the future holds for this rule, kind of covered on the next slide, is, we're still gearing up for that January 2026 compliance date and 27 for routine inspections. There's a lot of conversations going on about this rule. That's why we needed round 2 of this conversation. FDA has been holding a lot of industry roundtables. Industry itself has a lot of consortium type models going, public-private partnerships, where the industry, FDA are coming together and talking about the challenges, especially around interoperability of different systems, different ways we assign a lot code, different just nomenclature and vocabulary we use to be able to have our whole food supply chain be able to decipher and interpret and track under the spirit of this rule. SPCA, the one that is, leads PCQI training for preventive controls, for example, is developing training that's supposed to launch here in the summer of 2025. So there will be some formal training with regard to this rule as well. Lastly, other tips in addition to the gap assessment I encouraged you to do is, obviously, once you do that, prioritize within your business and, based upon your other business risks, and really make your best effort to try to meet the intent of this rule. Seek out some of these industry conversations and consortiums to perhaps participate in, so you can put your finger on the pulse of what industry is planning to do. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, and you can kind of go along, I'm not a huge fan of being a follower all the time. But, there's been a lot of good work underway where it could really save you some time, perhaps save you some capital, and just understanding what is in process to date. So I think with that, I'm gonna open it back up to Jen to see if she's got any remaining comments, and then we're opening it up to some Q&A.
Mel, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I know that many of the questions that came in will allow us to get into some of the more details and nuances of the rule. But 2 things that I would emphasize. One is that, yes, we have seen many buyers kind of expand the scope of where they want to see the elements of the rule applied to all foods. And in part, I think this is because if you put yourself in their shoes, the shoes of a receiver, a distributor, a store, they don't want to have multiple systems. They don't want to have to decide, is this on the rule, or is this, is this part of the rule? Is it on the list, or is it not? Like, oh, I'm going to do this thing for FTL foods and I'm going to do something else for non-FTL foods. Like, it's just probably easier for them to have one system. And if you're going to have one system, it has to be the one that's the more stringent system, the one where the rule does apply. The other thing is that this rule, unlike really most of the other FSMA related rules, the produce safety rule, preventive controls rule, they apply to your operation only. Produce safety rule applies to your farm. Preventive controls applies to your facility. This rule is about the full supply chain and really how the information that one entity has relates to the information another entity has. And so I think Melanie's point about interoperability, although data standards are not specified by the rule, they're not required by the rule, interoperability is not required by the rule, we all realize that in order for this rule to work, there has to be that broader industry conversation and ideally consensus around how are we going to communicate with each other so that things are as simple and as clear as possible. So those are the only 2 things that I wanted to highlight before turning it over to Abby and starting with our questions.
Awesome. Thank you both for the great presentations.